little triangles that I stick in here. The end of this, the compositionality of this locality was the formation of obligated matter as a means of transforming dislocation into proper dwelling. In other words, the point was not to extrapolate abstract theories of truth or to elaborate culture, but to pragmatically transform the geontics of space in order to make a place and a people who were internally made up of the same substance and thus bound to deepening the compositionality of the space itself. If their analytics was right and the process of recreating place people was successful, biography and geography would have to be responsive to each other because they were each other's external interiority. That is, the mutual orientation of bio and geographics would not be a function of choice but of compulsion. I cannot help think of my country, I cannot help think of me. And front and center, in other words, was a profound attention then to the nuanced interaction between human actions and geontologies. What got up for what? Kakateni karu, what got up for what? And by noticing what got up for what, did I get up for land, did you get up for me, did it get up for us? At the core of this was an interpretation of how and whether this mutuality and obligated relation was being created. Now, actually, if you looked at what they did, it was, I think, a major analytic and social accomplishment. They took, and again, this is just a stylized rendition, take the blue land as a kind of territorial rendering of the coastal place from which supposedly they had come. Take those little squarely things, those yellow things, as how a previous effect of the kind of substantial mutual making of bio and geography was occurring prior to colonialization. In dislocation, what these men and women did, they also used marriage connections, because that's a spatial distribution. They connected, you can see those lines, they connected the furthest ends of the spatially distributed groups, and then they connected the center of them, all of, in order to, when they then moved, and let's say that's a different place, that's Belyuen, when they moved up there and these new substantial forms of remaking occurred, they collapsed this spatially distended into a group and literally placed it in a new country. And in the process created various new ritual groundings that re-obligated people to place. So they literally recreated the landscape and the people at the same time, using and all the time analyzing the process as either effective or not effective. So we could say this was a major analytic accomplishment. But if their and it was working. But if their geontological science forged the internal relationship between a biography and a geography in the necropolitical context of settler dislocation and assimilation during the 1940s through the 1970s, it came under intense scrutiny in the 70s and through the 90s as a new form of liberal settler governance emerged in Australia itself, i.e. late liberal approaches to social difference, i.e. liberal cultural recognition, that underpinned the Land Rights Act, and that's the Land Rights Act, the Northern Territory, the Native Title Act, and the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority, otherwise known as Sacred Sites Authority. All of these established a strict textual relationship between a very specific token and type of the Indigenous subject that came to be known as the TO, or the traditional Aboriginal owner, the very thing I showed you in the beginning. A local descent group with common spiritual affiliations that places under primary spiritual responsibility for a place on the land. One of the key dimensions of this traditional Aboriginal owner was that it had to be a past-oriented, past-perfect-oriented subject. It is not that the law of cultural recognition didn't take into consideration the formations of geos and zoe and bios that it rightfully knew was critical to Indigenous people in Australia. You note it said common spirituality to a site on the landscape that placed it under primary spiritual affiliation for that site and the land, i.e. the site was a geological, it was a site, a rock, a riverbed, a tree, whatever. Indeed, supplicants to the law in the 70s and 80s, the land rights law, had to demonstrate a belief and obligation to specific sites, from a Western ontology, non-living things. Thus, they had to believe and show that they're obligated to, say, rocks that listened to them and responded to them as animate agents. And they had to demonstrate this in a variety of legal performative venues. But this belief had to have a certain geographical inertness to it. That is, it had to be a belief that showed a timeless truth transmitted without change in its narrative content or geographic reference. And more importantly, the supplicants must not be allowed to demonstrate their ability to make use of a geontology as a historical analytics. They must be the vehicles of a certain kind of dumb repetition of animist or totemic ritual, not sharp analysts of the mutual constitution of earth and human in changing historical contexts. As we know, some of us, the dominant questions of land rights era, both today but also in cultural heritage recognition in many indigenous contexts, is not what people did to constitute belonging in dislocation, but where they had been before dislocation and how much they match, word by word, stone by stone, that way of being prior to dislocation. Thus, in foregrounding what they had accomplished, the grandparents and parents of the people who are making this augmented reality project today, foregrounding their accomplishments, and they were really proud. They showed, look at what we did. They foregrounded their distance from the law of recognition. Their self-determination removed them from the governance of liberal self-determination. And it's little wonder that their geontological analytics confounded the law. These men and women were not thinking and acting at the level of the actual distribution of roles and parts that Rancière has called policing. They were acting at the level of the political insofar as they refused the division that placed them in late liberalism. The division between the past-oriented, past-perfect-oriented traditional subject and the future historically operating modern subject. And they lost. And in losing, they nevertheless supported that small group of young adults that then eventually led to a riot in 2007. And I should say it's not just it's not just land rights. It's all of the institutions of state governance that came to be organized around this idea of a traditional owner, and they're all through their various laws here that I was referring to. But in failing to produce a geography that could secure a biographic in late liberalism, these now deceased men and women nevertheless produced a potential space out of which came the augmented reality project that the Kadabing are now seeking to develop and the social subjectivity that subtends it. And here we remember that the failure of, I'm getting this through this one, the failure of an alternative social project from one perspective is often productive, well, it's always productive from another perspective. Remember, the members of the Kadabing were born and raised on the same community, Belyuen, that their parents and grandparents practiced their geontological analytics. They went through the ceremonies there that their parents and grandparents saw coming out of the land through this obligatory response. They buried their dead relatives there, and they burnt their things in, well, maybe that's it for, oh no, here we go. Okay, okay, good. That's up on the Cox Peninsula. They went through the ceremonies, they buried their dead relatives, they burnt things in rituals, the way I'm supposed to burn my archive, in what they considered their country. That is, they experienced themselves as their parents taught them to experience themselves as from and obligated to this particular landscape. Thus, they experienced also the devastating law of recognition that refused to recognize the value of their parents' and grandparents' actions and the violent ends that resulted from this non-recognition. But in leaving, and then they left, right? But in leaving this seemingly failed geontology. They brought to a new place, and this is the outstation that I was talking about they went to. They brought to this new place the promise that lie behind the failure of their parents and grandparents. They operate not as members of disjointed clans, which, of course, once the law of recognition tried to force people back into their traditional country, members of Belyuen would be from various clans, not one. But instead of operating as distinct groupings, they continue to operate as a unity across the very divisions that the law disrupted in their parents' geontology. Thus, the idea of Katabing as not a language group, not a descent group, not a territorial designation, but rather a state of geological affairs. That is, Katabing is a tide, it's not a place. And as a tide, it's a concept that the Katabing see as containing a certain hope and promise of overcoming not only the conditions of their dislocation now from the Cox Peninsula down the coast, but also hope that they can find a way of dwelling in late liberalism and its modes of communicative technology while maintaining this geontological imaginary handed to them by their grandparents and parents. The question is whether or not and how this project, this hope, is able to make its way in the contemporary world of what might be collapsing late liberal forms and within the imaginary of climate change and the given organization of the technologies of new communication, similar to the way that their parents and grandparents tried to test whether their geontological science could make a way in the world of assimilation and then supposed recognition. To answer this question in just a couple more pages is to ask a question about what in trying to make a new obligation between people and place, the Katabing are becoming obligated to in terms of a social technology, a technological sociality, and the given conditions of liberal governance. So there are just two things that I want to close by looking at in terms of just sketching out the kind of worlds that the Katabing are now making their way through that differ from the world that their parents and grandparents were making their way through. The first difference would have to do with the form of liberalism itself. If late liberalism, for me, indicated how liberalism in the 60s and 70s was responding to two legitimacy crises, that is, one which was economic, stagflation, and another which was social, that is, both social, the emergence of new social movements and the sustained attack of paternalistic colonialism through the anti-colonial movement, with the response being neoliberalism as a response to the seemingly failure of Keynesian markets, and liberal forms of recognition as a response to the assault on paternalistic colonialism and the governance of difference. Today it seems to me that we're facing, if not the collapse of late liberalism, at least the crisis in it. And that crisis comes from out of the wake of the 9/11, and in the wake of 9/11, the announcement across Europe and in Australia that the politics of cultural recognition or multiculturalism was dead. So we had our Prime Minister, we had Cameron, we had Merkel, we had Sarkozy, and we had in Australia the very man who created the intervention, Howard, all saying that multiculturalism as an experiment was over. And then in the financial crisis of 2008, we had neoliberalism as a mode of organizing the relationship between state and market suddenly under crisis, and then also putting democracy under crisis. Thus, when the Katabing go about trying to create their augmented reality project, they have to negotiate both late liberalism as it has existed, that is neoliberalism and liberal multiculturalism, and the failure of those two and the crisis of those two. Thus, when I said in the beginning that we've yet to find financial backing, One of the reasons is that the very backing that we had committed to the project in late 2007 was withdrawn, of course, in the financial crisis of 2008, in which suddenly it was no longer the case that companies could just spend their resources on social projects. And unless we could come up with a commodifiable object that could make money now rather than in the long term, I'm sorry, but we were told these major corporations like Telstra and other phone companies would have to just wait and see how their budgets went. The second problem was that late liberalism as a liberal form of multiculturalism, and in Australia with the intervention, a claim that those days were over and culture was a problem, sandwiched the project from two different directions. On the one hand, those who said cultural support was over questioned what we would be putting in our project. What was this culture that we would be selling, and whether people wanted to know whether to support it. And on the other hand, those who still supported cultural recognition didn't like the idea of a business. But the second, and where I want to end, the second question in terms of how they have to make their way through the contemporary social world in which they find themselves, the way their parents had to make a way through their world, was indeed, it brings us back to the question of the Anthropocene. And what indeed the Anthropocene as a geontology demands, both opens and demands, what promises and refuses when it comes to this project. Again, as you know, as I've said, the Anthropocene is a geological term that looks at the way in which human actions have created a crisis in the carbon cycles of the world. The other thing to know, of course, that the geology, modern geology, that gives us the concept of the Anthropocene itself emerged at the very moment that this new Anthropocene period began. That is, modern geology began during the Industrial Revolution as these huge coal seams were being blasted out to power the factories in Manchester and elsewhere, and revealed all sorts of fossil remnants. So even as the Anthropocene suggests a new kind of animism in which the earth is the actor on the human subject, it refuses in critical ways, because of the scientific principles on which it's grounded, certain forms of human and landscape interactions. So while the Anthropocene might see fossils as giving us a record of the past, it does not see, and this is a site that we'd be using, see the shape of the earth, and this is you should know, it's a barramundi dreaming. You can see the tail at the end. The shape of the earth as literally communicating the meaning of the earth. It only gives us a historical time of the earth. Not only that, but the very technological equipment that would subtend the communicative apparatus of the augmented reality project presupposes the earth as a kind of thing that is created through technology, GPS satellites, operated by certain forces. This is, of course, US military command of DHBS, and understands the earth from the perspective of nowhere. That is created by, as we know, from another specific technology, that is the satellite. This technology of the earth as seen from beyond the earth, organized by a satellite view from nowhere, creating the ability of us to have GPS-based points that never change no matter how the earth changes, of course goes directly against the very kinds of geontological interactions between biography and geography that subtends the Cotabine geontology, and may indeed fit better with the very laws of recognition that have continually undermined the project. Thank you.